In fantasy, we often find stories that are about heroes and the fate of nations. In today's video, I'll give you 4 steps in which you can create your own fantasy kingdom. We'll do a quick and easy rundown of things like culture, history, the landscape, and demographics. Let's get into it. Hi guys, my name is Jesper and welcome to the Fane of Fantasy. This channel is all about giving you inspiration to master your craft and create fantasy that will truly immerse your audience. Let's just dive straight into the deep end with creating a fantasy kingdom. The first thing to consider is the landscape itself, because it has a huge impact on civilization and also how the people of these lands will evolve from a cultural perspective. So if your kingdom resides on islands, they might be a fairly secluded people, but maybe also very strong in seafaring. I actually talked about this in my map making book too, and the idea is to let the outlay of the land itself become one of the key building blocks. You know, and another example could be the Mongols. They were steppe people, and for that reason they were the best horse archers in the world. Or on the opposite side of the scale, to our secluded island people, perhaps the kingdom is situated in a peaceful rural land and therefore ends up having a more relaxed attitude. Or how about the elite warriors of Sparta? You see how that works? Fundamentals such as the landscape will affect the people living there. And since this is so fundamental and at the core of things, that's often a good place to start. In other words, consider the landscape and make a decision on what profound effect it will have on your kingdom. With that locked in place, it's usually easy to move on to the history of the kingdom. This is of course also where the first caveat comes in to what I just said before about the landscape. You see, nations do change over time. So one nation could have a background as a seafaring kingdom, even if you decide not to include any trees on their lands from which they can build their boats. Perhaps the trees were cut down in a previous age to create their tremendous naval capabilities, much like Spain in the Middle Ages. Just know that you have your options here, and in considering the history of the kingdom, look for the important details only. What are the things that actually has a meaningful effect in shaping the kingdom and the people living there? I mean, a rich history is great, but this is often where we world builders end up going completely bonkers and develops God knows how many pages of backstory. That is almost never needed. All right, step 3 is culture. This is the biggest one of our 4 steps, as it encompasses everything that the people of a kingdom do. So we are talking about language, religion, social structures. All of it makes up a kingdom's culture, and thus also how people act. It informs your world building because culture also dictates the rulers. What is it that the ruler of the kingdom wants and needs, and how does that affect the relationship with other nations? There are loads more to culture than this, I know, but for today's video that's where I want to focus, because it is a prime driver for conflict, and where there is conflict, there is story. Your weaker nations will likely rely on trade and perhaps gaining favor somehow from the stronger nations to acquire some kind of military protection, whereas those at the top of the power scale is likely to become or be more aggressive and demanding towards their neighbors. What I'm saying is that you can easily use culture to decide the relationship between nations. Their individual sizes are one thing. Something else is also their perspective on life. The Mongols, who I mentioned just a moment ago, never negotiated with anyone. At least to my knowledge, they didn't. Some questions you can ask yourself are: how did this culture come into being? What do this culture strive for? What would other countries say about this culture? What kind of leadership is present? Do the leader have strong disagreement with other leaders? That should get you going. Before heading into the fourth step, which is demographics, I want to remind you that if this is your first time here, please make sure to subscribe and learn to master the craft of creating immersing fantasy world settings and characters, because there is new videos for you every single Monday. So, demographics. In dealing with a fantasy setting, I'm thinking of the different races living in the kingdom when I say demographics. So are they all human? Do you find elves and orcs and perhaps some race of your own creation too in the kingdom? Here too, I want to focus on the part that generates story, namely conflict. When dealing with different races, ask yourself whether or not it could be cause for internal conflicts within the kingdom. Perhaps trade routes are being shut down. Maybe there is a civil war brewing between the different races. No matter what it is, make sure that it has some kind of impact on the character. That part is really important. It shouldn't be something that is only happening in a far off land with no consequence. So if there's civil war, put the character close to it. You know, a homestead where everything is nice and cozy, it's not that interesting as one where, you know, something else is brewing. You know, even if you look at the Shire from Lord of the Rings, the hobbits had something to worry about too. It wasn't any immediate danger, but it lurked and could reach them in the Shire one day unless they decided to do something about it. I managed to finish up my book on getting story ideas. I actually did decide to hold off on releasing it for quite a while because next up I have a book on plotting that I want to write, and the story idea one goes pretty well with a book on plotting. So I think I will release both later in the year instead. Otherwise, all I can say is that I'm still very hard at work with the world building course. I make progress on it most days, but there are still miles and miles of road ahead before I reach the finish line. But that's okay, as long as you enjoy the journey. That's the most important thing, isn't it? If you haven't done so already, don't forget to follow me on social media. Stay safe out there and see you next Monday.